She remained silent until the very end. But a minute before the divorce, she arrived in a limousine and everything changed. Watch until the end. Subscribe so you don't miss the next stories. Write in the comments where you're watching from. The sunlight streamed through the tall windows of the craftsman-style home on the east side of Atlanta, settling softly on the polished hardwood floors and cream-colored walls. The morning was quiet, broken only by the gentle clinking of silverware against porcelain as Nia folded a cloth napkin and placed it neatly beside her husband's coffee mug. The smell of toasted bread and turkey bacon filled the kitchen, mingling with the faint citrus scent of her lotion. The house was immaculate, just as she liked it, just as she had always kept it. Across the table, her 10-year-old son, Caleb, slurped cereal from his bowl, his feet swinging from the tall breakfast stool. His homework binder sat open beside him, and his sneakers, clean of course, waited by the back door. She glanced at the clock. 7:43 a.m. right on schedule. Nia poured a second cup of coffee and set it down in front of her husband, who had yet to look up from his phone. "Thanks," Edward mumbled, eyes fixed on the screen as he scrolled through emails or news or maybe a client's Instagram. She couldn't tell anymore. He didn't look up when she brushed a strand of hair from his brow, or when she mentioned the parent-teacher conference scheduled for Thursday. He simply nodded and muttered something that might have been a yes. Caleb, oblivious, launched into a story about a new science experiment at school, his enthusiasm bubbling, but Edward didn't hear him. Or he didn't try to. Nia smiled faintly at her son and responded where his father didn't, nodding in all the right places, offering small affirmations, though her mind had already begun to drift. She remembered mornings like this years ago, when they lived in a one-bedroom apartment above a bakery, when they couldn't afford separate mugs, let alone a matching kitchen set. They used to share a single cup of coffee, passing it between them while they whispered about dreams and deadlines. Edward would hold her hand and say, "Someday, we'll wake up in a house with a yard and sunlight in every room." And they had. The dream had manifested, the 5-bedroom home, the landscaped garden, the child they adored. Only somewhere along the way, the laughter had faded. The warmth had dulled. The man who once traced stars on her skin while she slept now barely looked at her over breakfast. Edward stood suddenly, smoothing his shirt and grabbing his leather folio from the counter. "Meeting's at 8, he said, already halfway to the door. "You'll pick up Caleb this evening?" she asked, rinsing a dish. He hesitated, and in that hesitation she felt it again, that space growing wider between them like a crack in drywall. "I'll try," he said without commitment. "Depends how late things run." She nodded, lips pressed together in a familiar line. As the door shut behind him, the house fell silent again. She could still hear the echo of his shoes against the tile, the jingle of his keys, but not a single word of affection, not a glance, not a goodbye. Later, after dropping Caleb off at school, Nia returned home and wandered the now quiet house. She walked slowly, aimlessly, fingers trailing over furniture she had chosen, artwork she had hung, curtains she had sewn with her mother during those early days of homeownership. In every corner was a reminder of her, the version of herself who once believed in permanence. In their bedroom, she began tidying up Edward's side of the bed. She noticed, not for the first time, that his pillow was barely touched. Some nights he didn't even sleep beside her. He claimed to work late, sometimes fell asleep on the couch, sometimes just needed space. She had convinced herself not to ask too many questions, but lately the questions had started to push their way out of her chest and into her throat, pressing hard. That evening, after dinner, she opened the laundry hamper and began sorting through Edward's clothes. She always did his laundry. It was a ritual that once felt intimate. She used to find love notes in his pockets. Now she found receipts. As she lifted one of his dress shirts, she noticed the faint trace of lipstick on the collar. A subtle shade of pink, barely visible, but not hers. She blinked at it, heart knocking against her ribs. Carefully, she set it aside. She told herself it could have been from someone brushing past him. A client, maybe. A stranger at a networking event, that's all. But as she walked to their bathroom and caught her reflection in the mirror, she didn't believe the story she was trying to sell herself. That night, she couldn't sleep. Edward hadn't come home. He hadn't texted either. She lay on her side of the bed, staring at the empty pillow, her arms wrapped around herself. The clock read 1:17 a.m. when she finally closed her eyes, not from rest, but from exhaustion. The next morning, he returned as if nothing had happened. He smelled like cologne she didn't recognize. He showered quickly, dressed, and left again with only a murmured, "Back late tonight." No explanations, no apologies, no awareness of her unraveling. On Saturday, after she'd taken Caleb to a birthday party, Nia sat alone in the living room and opened Edward's laptop. She'd never done it before, but something inside her, a voice long suppressed, told her to stop pretending she didn't know. The screen lit up with a dozen open tabs. One of them was a reservations page for a luxury hotel downtown. Another was a chat window. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. She clicked. The messages were recent, intimate. One in particular made her stomach lurch. Claire. Last night was heaven. Can't wait for next weekend. She didn't cry. Not at first. She sat frozen, eyes fixed to the screen, reading every line, every emoji, every joke. Edward was in love, or at least infatuated, with a woman who wasn't her. A woman named Claire, who sent him selfies in silk robes, who called him E, and signed off with hearts. Only when she closed the laptop did the tears come, hot and soundless. When Edward came home that night, she didn't confront him. She didn't know how. Not yet. She simply watched him from the hallway as he placed his keys on the hook and kissed Caleb on the head before disappearing into his office. As if nothing had shattered. In the days that followed, she moved through the house like a ghost, performing routines without conviction. She cooked, she cleaned, she replied to emails, she smiled at neighbors, but inside she felt hollowed out. She considered calling a friend, her sister, even her pastor, but the shame was heavy, sticky. She kept thinking of all the times she had defended Edward, how she had praised him in public, how she had smiled through the discontent. One night, unable to bear the silence, she picked up an old photo album. It was filled with memories, college days, their wedding, the first ultrasound of Caleb. She stopped at a picture from their honeymoon. They were standing on a beach in Tulum, laughing, sun-kissed and barefoot. He had his arm around her waist. She was leaning into him, eyes closed. She remembered that girl, how full of hope she was, how certain she felt that she had married the man who would love her forever. And then her phone vibrated. A new message from Edward. At work, don't wait up. No kiss, no heart, not even her name. She looked at the photo again. Then she closed the album. The next morning, she walked into their bedroom with a small suitcase and began packing. Just a few clothes, enough for a few days. She didn't know where she was going yet, but staying felt impossible. Not because he was cheating, though that cut deep, but because the man in the house with her was no longer someone she recognized, and worse, he no longer recognized her. As she zipped the bag, Caleb stood at the doorway, rubbing his eyes. "Are we going somewhere?" he asked. Nia knelt in front of him, smoothing his hair. "Just for a little while," she said softly. And for the first time in weeks, she felt her own voice again, quiet, uncertain, but still hers. Something had broken, but something else, deep beneath the surface, had just begun to stir. The apartment was small and smelled faintly of fresh paint and floor cleaner. Nia hadn't had time to do much with it, just enough to make it feel livable for Caleb's sake. A gray love seat she found on sale filled the corner near the window, and a couple of second-hand chairs formed a modest dining area. The kitchen was compact but functional. On the first night, she slept on an air mattress while Caleb curled beside her, clutching the same stuffed dinosaur he'd had since he was 3. It wasn't home, not in the way the house had been, but it was quiet. It was hers. She hadn't told many people, not yet, not even her sister, who would have flown in from Charlotte that very night. She didn't want the questions. She wasn't ready to hear the things she already knew said aloud, that something sacred had died, that her marriage, once a story she told with pride, had become a hollow performance. She moved on instinct, registered Caleb at the nearby school, signed lease forms, called the utility companies. Her voice on the phone was steady, as if she weren't dragging the weight of 15 years behind her. As if she weren't waking up in the middle of the night, reaching for a body that wasn't there. Edward didn't fight it. When she texted him that she and Caleb would be moving out for a while, he replied with a simple, "Do what you need to do." No plea, no protest, no effort. That was what hurt the most. Not the betrayal, not even the deceit, but the fact that he didn't seem to care. The apartment complex had a small playground and a modest courtyard. On weekends, Nia sat on a bench with a book in hand, watching Caleb chase after soccer balls with kids whose names she barely remembered. Sometimes she would look up at the clouds and wonder how she got here, how the life she had built so carefully had collapsed in silence. It wasn't until the 3rd week that she saw it. A photo, casually posted to social media by someone Edward had worked with. A snapshot from a wine-tasting event. There was Edward, wearing the navy blazer she had bought him last Christmas, smiling at the camera. And beside him, dressed in a sleek red dress and resting her hand on his chest, was Claire. She looked younger than Nia had expected. Not just younger in years, but in spirit, carefree, polished in a way Nia hadn't felt in a long time. She stared at the image for several long minutes. The comments stung more than the photo itself. Someone had written, "Beautiful couple." Another, "Power pair right here." The approval was easy, seamless, unearned. No one in the photo knew the woman who'd packed Edward's lunches for years, who'd proofread his proposals at 2 a.m, who'd held his hand through the infertility scare and the first failed investor pitch. Nia closed her laptop and sat very still. Her hands, folded in her lap, trembled slightly. She didn't call him, she didn't confront him. She had done enough of that in her mind. She had rehearsed 1,000 monologues, every one of them ending with him stunned and sorry, realizing what he'd thrown away. But in real life there was no audience, no dramatic climax, just a quiet descent into reality. Later that week, she bumped into an old friend at the grocery store. Dana, bright-eyed and talkative, immediately noticed something was wrong. "Where's Edward? Haven't seen you two together in ages." Nia hesitated, her grip tightening on the handle of her shopping cart. "We're taking some space," she said, her voice tight. Dana tilted her head, her expression a mixture of sympathy and surprise. "I'm sorry to hear that, but you always seemed so solid. I thought if anyone had it figured out, it was you two." Nia nodded faintly, managing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "So did I." That night, she stared at her ceiling, tracing the outlines of the water stains above her bed. Every crack in the plaster felt personal, symbolic of something deeper unraveling. She thought of how easily people could be fooled, how long she had fooled even herself. For so long, she had equated endurance with love, had believed that standing by a man, no matter what, was the highest form of loyalty. She had silenced her doubts, smoothed over the distance, and explained away every dismissal with grace. But grace had limits. And now, all that unspoken pain was pressing against the walls of her chest like floodwater. Caleb was adjusting better than she expected. Kids had a resilience she envied. He made friends quickly, adapted to the new school, and even seemed to enjoy their smaller space. But one night, as she tucked him into bed, he asked, "When is Daddy coming to visit us here?" Nia's throat tightened. "He's busy with work right now," she replied softly, "but you can talk to him any time." Caleb nodded, clearly unsatisfied but too tired to argue. After he fell asleep, she sat on the balcony with a blanket around her shoulders and watched the city lights in the distance. She thought about calling her mother, her sister, even her pastor again, but the thought of having to explain still made her stomach turn. Instead, she opened a new document on her laptop and began to write. She didn't know what it was. Maybe a letter she would never send. Maybe a confession to herself. She titled it, "What I Know." The first line came easily. "I know he loved me once. Then, I know I loved him longer than he deserved. And finally, I know this isn't my fault." She wrote for hours. Words poured out like water breaking through a dam. She wrote about the way he stopped laughing at her jokes, the way he stopped saying her name, the way his eyes lit up for other people but dulled when he looked at her. In the morning, she printed the pages and tucked them into a folder. She didn't read them again, but holding them in her hands made her feel a little less invisible. On a rainy Sunday afternoon, she received a call from her sister, Layla. "I know something's wrong," Layla said without preamble. "You've been dodging me for weeks." Nia sighed and leaned against the kitchen counter. "It's over," she said simply. Layla was quiet for a beat. "He cheated?" "Yes. With someone I know? Her name is Claire." Layla let out a slow breath. "You want me to come down?" "No," Nia replied. "I just needed to say it out loud." For a few moments, neither of them spoke. Then Layla said, "He doesn't get to define your story, Nia. You hear me? Don't let this be the last chapter." That night, Nia sat in bed and looked around the apartment. The boxes, still half unpacked, the blank walls, the cheap lamp flickering by the door. It wasn't a palace, but it was a beginning. She reached under the bed and pulled out the folder she'd filled with pages. She flipped through them slowly, as if searching for something she'd missed. At the very end, she added one final line in careful handwriting. "The only thing worse than losing him would be losing myself trying to keep him." She placed the folder on the nightstand and turned off the lamp. Across town, in the house that used to be hers, Claire was lighting candles in the dining room. Edward was laughing at something she said, pouring wine into glasses that Nia had once chosen for their 10th anniversary. He looked happy, effortlessly, maddeningly happy. But Nia no longer cared what he looked like. She knew the truth now, and truth, no matter how sharp, was the only path to freedom. The morning came in shades of gray. Rain tapped lightly against the apartment windows, soft and constant, like a breath Nia couldn't release. She stood in the narrow kitchen, holding a chipped mug of coffee she hadn't sipped, staring blankly out at the puddled courtyard below. A few children in raincoats trudged toward the bus stop, splashing through the water with carefree abandon. Caleb had left earlier, wrapped in his blue poncho, his backpack bouncing with each step as he waved goodbye without waiting for her to answer. He had adjusted so quickly it unsettled her, as though children knew how to let go of what grown-ups clung to. The apartment was quiet now, too quiet, and the silence pressed in on her like a weight. She had grown used to the hum of the old house, the creak of the stairs, the distant sound of Edward's voice on a work call, the buzz of Caleb's cartoons echoing from the living room. Here, in this new space, every sound seemed foreign. Every silence carried too much meaning. She sat at the small table, the mug growing cold in her hands, and picked up a pen. The notebook in front of her was the same one she had found buried in a moving box, a leather-bound relic from her college days. It had once held design sketches and floor plans, dreams drawn with thin-tipped pens and annotated in the margins with coffee stains and optimism. Now it would become something else, a record, a release, a reckoning. She flipped to a clean page and began to write. The words came slow at first, halting, uncertain. Then, like water behind a dam, they poured out. She wrote about the lipstick on Edward's collar, the messages from Claire, the photo that had gone viral in her small circle of acquaintances. She wrote about the way he said her name, when he still did, as if it were something inconvenient. She didn't try to sound composed or clever, she just told the truth. She wrote for an hour, maybe longer. When she finally set the pen down, her hand ached and her coffee had gone stone cold. But something in her chest had shifted, just slightly, like air returning to a room that had been closed off for too long. That afternoon, she pulled an old plastic bin from the closet and began to sift through the remnants of her past life. Inside were framed photos, certificates, and a crumpled folder labeled Arch 112, Final Project. She opened it with a shaky breath and stared down at the architectural sketches she hadn't touched in years. Curved roof lines, natural light studies, sustainable materials, notes in her handwriting that still felt like her even now. She remembered the passion she'd had back then, the certainty, before Edward's ambitions had become their only focus, before her own dreams were packed away into plastic bins and dusty folders, before she became a fixture in someone else's life instead of the architect of her own. She spent the next few days reshaping her routine. She set an alarm. She dressed not just to cover herself, but to feel present. She walked Caleb to school even when it rained. She stopped ordering takeout and started cooking again. Not for Edward, not to impress or please, but for the ritual of it, the control. The small act of feeding herself with her own hands. But the silence remained, even as life began to stretch its limbs again. It followed her through the grocery store, trailed her steps through the apartment. At night, it sat beside her on the couch while she watched shows she used to love and found them dull. It crept into her sheets when she lay in bed, replacing Edward's absence with something more sinister, a numbness that threatened to calcify. One evening, she found herself reaching for her phone, thumb hovering over Layla's name. She didn't want to talk, not really, but the silence needed to be broken. Layla answered on the second ring. "Hey," Nia exhaled. "Hey, you okay?" "I don't know," she said truthfully. They talked in fragments. Layla told her about a new yoga class she was trying dot, about Mom asking for her, about a movie she saw that reminded her of them as kids. Nia listened, occasionally replying, grateful just to hear another voice. Before they hung up, Layla said softly, "You're not alone, Nia, even when it feels like it." That night, Nia pulled the sketchbook back out and began to draw. Not buildings this time, just lines, curves, shapes without destination. Her hand moved with a rhythm that felt ancient, instinctual. The page filled slowly, her breath deepening as it did. It wasn't art, not yet, but it was hers. The next morning, she stood at the mirror and stared at her reflection. She didn't look broken. She looked tired, yes, a little older, but there was still a spark in her eyes that hadn't fully dimmed. She straightened her shoulders and told herself the truth. Edward had not destroyed her. He had just stopped deserving her. A week later, she applied for a position at a local architecture firm. It was a small, women-led company focused on sustainable community spaces. The job posting had been forwarded to her by a former professor who had added, "You still have it in you. Don't forget that." She almost didn't apply, almost talked herself out of it. But Caleb found her sitting in front of the laptop and asked what she was doing. "Something brave," she answered and clicked send. When the interview came through, she felt both elated and terrified. She had nothing to wear that felt like her. Everything in her closet reminded her of PTA meetings and holiday dinners with Edward's clients. So she went shopping, alone, in silence, with purpose. She chose a dark green dress that hugged her form without apology, and a pair of sensible heels that made her feel tall. At the fitting room mirror, she stared at herself again and thought, "You're still in there." The day of the interview was cold and bright. She arrived early, hands damp with nerves, portfolio clutched tightly. The office was in a converted warehouse filled with natural light, plants, and laughter. A young receptionist offered her tea and smiled warmly. It wasn't sterile. It wasn't intimidating. It felt alive. The interview went better than she expected. The lead architect, a woman named Clarice with salt and pepper braids and eyes like sharpened steel, asked pointed questions but listened with care. When Nia showed her one of her college designs, Clarice studied it for a long moment before saying, "You think in space, not just form. That's rare." When she walked out of the building, the wind caught her scarf and whipped it behind her like a cape. She laughed, surprised by the sound of her own joy. The offer came 2 days later. She started on a Monday. The office buzzed with energy, the hum of collaboration. Her first assignment was modest, a concept for a youth reading room in a city library, but it was a beginning. She found herself staying late, not because she had to, but because her hands didn't want to stop. She shared little with her coworkers at first, just her name, her job history, a polite smile. No one asked about her personal life, and she didn't offer. But one afternoon during a break, a colleague named Patrice said quietly, "You've got a grace about you, like someone who's been through hell and didn't let it steal your kindness." Nia blinked, throat tightening. "Thank you," she whispered. That evening, she picked up Caleb from school and stopped for ice cream, just because. They sat in the car, windows fogged, his laughter bubbling as he told her about a spelling bee he'd won. She smiled and thought, this is still a life, a good one. Later, as she tucked him in, he reached out and touched her face. "You're happy," he said simply. She nodded, tears stinging her eyes. "Getting there." When he drifted off to sleep, she returned to her desk and opened her notebook again. On a fresh page, she wrote, "Silence is no longer my prison. It's my armor." And beneath it, this is not the end. It's the part where I begin again." Nia was early to the office that morning, arriving just as the janitor was finishing the lobby floors. The scent of fresh pine cleaner followed her as she made her way to her desk, the faint click of her low heels echoing in the quiet, half-lit space. Her keycard beeped softly as she entered the shared workroom, and she stood for a moment at her drafting table, taking in the way the light filtered through the tall windows. She had begun to appreciate silence again, but this time it didn't weigh her down. It allowed her thoughts to settle. It made space for movement. It had been 3 months since her first day, and the rhythm of the office now pulsed beneath her skin like muscle memory. The team had grown to respect her, slowly but surely. At first, there had been a cautious distance, as there often was in tight creative teams, but Nia's designs spoke for her. Her work carried a quiet confidence that needed no embellishment. She had earned her place. Her current project, a community garden and gathering space in a low-income neighborhood near Edgewood, had become her obsession. She had poured herself into every detail, reworking it until the design matched the values she now lived by: clarity, intention, accessibility, beauty. It was the kind of project that reminded her why she fell in love with architecture in the first place, not for prestige, but for purpose. Not for the high-rises that bore someone else's name, but for places where people could breathe, rest, gather. Clarice, her lead-in mentor, had begun to entrust her with more leadership. "You don't speak often," she had told Nia one day after reviewing her sketches, "but when you do, people listen. Use that." The praise felt strange, but not undeserved. It touched a part of her that had gone unused for too long. She remembered the girl who once stood in lecture halls defending her models to skeptical professors, the girl who once believed her voice could reshape skylines. At home, things had changed too. Caleb had grown more confident in their new rhythm. He didn't ask about Edward as often, and when he did, it was in the way children ask about things they've accepted are not returning. Nia no longer stumbled over explanations. She told the truth gently. "Daddy made choices that didn't include us, but we're okay." She had stopped watching Edward's movements online. She no longer checked his profiles, no longer scanned photos for hints of Claire's presence. That chapter was soft closing, not with violence, but with finality. Still, the world had a way of reintroducing what you had put away. One Thursday afternoon, Clarice called Nia into her office to share news. The community project had been selected for a citywide initiative focused on neighborhood revitalization. There would be press coverage, meetings with local officials, additional funding. Nia's name would be listed as the project lead. "You've earned this," Clarice said, her gaze firm. "I need you to step into the light." Nia nodded, heart swelling with quiet pride. That evening, she picked up a bottle of wine and made her favorite stew, rich, thick, seasoned with thyme and warmth. She and Caleb ate on the couch, giggling at an old cartoon they both secretly liked, and for the first time in years she felt the weight of joy, not because of someone else's approval, but because she had built something that couldn't be taken from her. But peace, she had learned, was never uninterrupted. The next morning, Edward showed up at the front door of her apartment. She opened it slowly, unsure what to expect. He looked worn. Not thinner, but deflated. His once neatly trimmed beard had grown uneven, and the usual precision of his suits was replaced with a wrinkled jacket and unshaven jaw. He stood with his hands in his pockets, trying to smile. "I was in the neighborhood," he said, though she knew that wasn't true. She didn't invite him in. She stepped outside, closing the door gently behind her. The air was crisp with early spring, the wind playing with the hem of her cardigan. "What do you want, Edward?" He shifted, his smile fading. "I've been thinking a lot," he said, "about everything. I messed up. I know I did. Claire and I, it's not what I thought. She left." Nia didn't flinch. "I'm sorry to hear that." He blinked, surprised by her tone. "I was hoping we could talk. Maybe have dinner sometime, for Caleb's sake at least." Nia crossed her arms. "Caleb's fine. He's thriving, actually." He frowned. "You're really not going to give me a chance?" She tilted her head slightly. "A chance for what, exactly? To undo what's already been done?" "I didn't mean for it to go that far," he muttered. "I was lost. You know how stressful things got." She stepped closer, her voice low and steady. "I wasn't your stress relief, Edward. I was your wife. You didn't get lost. You walked away." He had no answer, just a slumping of shoulders, a sigh that landed nowhere. When he left, she watched him go without regret. Later that week, while updating paperwork for her firm's tax filing, she came across a line item in an old shared bank document that caught her attention. A business loan in both of their names, taken out 9 months prior. Her name was listed as co-signer, yet she had never signed such a form. Her breath caught as she scrolled through the scanned documents. There it was. Her signature, carefully forged, down to the curve of the S in her middle name. She stared at it for a long time, a coldness blooming in her chest. It wasn't just betrayal anymore. It was fraud. She printed the file, hands trembling, and placed it in her notebook. Then she called Layla. "This isn't just about love," she said quietly. "He's been using my name. Legally." Layla didn't hesitate. "You need a lawyer, a real one." That night, after Caleb went to bed, she made tea and sat at her desk, notebook open to a clean page. At the top, she wrote, "He stole more than my trust." She listed the documents she remembered signing, then the ones she didn't. She marked dates, amounts, phone numbers. Each line brought a new layer of anger, but not the kind that burned. This anger was cold, clean, resolute. The next morning, she scheduled a consultation with a legal firm that specialized in asset recovery and marital fraud. Jordan Freeman was young for a senior associate, but his eyes were sharp and his handshake firm. He listened without interruption as she laid out her story, his pen gliding silently across the page. When she finished, he leaned back, steepling his fingers. "You have a case," he said, "not just for divorce, but for annulment based on fraud and misrepresentation. If he took out loans in your name without your consent, that's a crime. And it's a legal basis to challenge the validity of your marriage contract." She swallowed hard. "I don't want to destroy him. I just want to protect myself and Caleb." Jordan nodded. "Then we build carefully, strategically, with evidence." She left the office with a folder tucked under her arm and a storm rising in her blood. Not rage, not vengeance, just truth. Truth that needed a stage. When she got home, she pulled out the pale blue dress she hadn't worn in years. It no longer fit as it once did. It hugged her tighter, showed her new lines, but it still made her feel sharp. She looked at herself in the mirror and whispered, "Let them underestimate me." That weekend, as she sat with Caleb at the park, sipping coffee while he chased a soccer ball, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Power. Not over others. Over herself. She had stood back up, and this time she would not be knocked down again. The day the summons was filed, Nia stood alone in her apartment, her hands wrapped tightly around the edges of the manila folder Jordan had given her. Her fingers trembled slightly, not with fear, but with the release of something long held. It was as if for the first time in years her life had weight again, not the kind that drags you down, but the kind that gives you shape. She placed the folder gently on the kitchen table, exhaled, and walked into the bedroom. Outside, the early bloom of spring had begun to paint the edges of the city in light green. Trees were stretching toward the sky again, shedding their winter shells, but inside Nia's world, something else was shedding, quietly, decisively. Every memory that had once lived in shadow was now stepping into the sun. She sat down on the edge of her bed and opened her laptop. Jordan had sent her a full list of documents that would support the annulment claim. Financial records, signature comparisons, timestamps on electronic loan applications. She scrolled through each page slowly, reading every line, not because she didn't believe him, but because she needed to see it for herself. There was something brutal and beautiful about truth. It didn't ask for permission. It didn't soften its edges. It simply stood, tall and irrefutable. He had used her name, her trust, her silence. While she was packing lunches and balancing PTA meetings and managing the invisible labor of their life, he had been signing her into debt. With a flourish of forged ink, he tied her to loans, some of which had already defaulted. Her name, once a symbol of the future she believed in, now appeared on balance sheets littered with liability. She didn't cry. There were no tears left for that version of pain. Instead, she pulled a notepad from the drawer and began to make a list. Dates, companies, payment schedules. Next to each item, she drew a line and wrote one of two words, mine or his. It was her way of reclaiming what belonged to her and releasing what didn't. When Caleb returned home from school that afternoon, she greeted him with a smile, helped him with his math worksheet, and made grilled cheese sandwiches the way he liked them, cut diagonally, crusts off, just a little too much butter. The normalcy of the moment anchored her. He didn't need to know what she was preparing to do, not yet. His world was still whole, and she would do everything to keep it that way. That evening, after he had gone to bed, she called Layla and told her everything. The forgery, the loans, the meeting with Jordan. He didn't just lie to me, she said, her voice steady. He used me. Layla was silent for a beat, then said, "You're not the one who should be ashamed. He is." "I know." "You still want to do the annulment?" "I've already filed." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full. Full of understanding. Full of the weight of sisters who had lived through enough to know what it meant when a woman chose herself. The following week, Jordan called with an update. "We'll be serving Edward officially on Friday," he said. "If you want to stay ahead of it, you may want to prepare for fallout." Nia knew exactly what that meant. Edward would not go quietly. He hadn't loved her enough to protect her, but his ego would not allow her to leave with dignity. Still, she was ready. She knew who he was now, and she knew who she was too. On Thursday afternoon, she received a text from him. "Edward, can we talk?" She stared at the screen for a long minute, then typed a reply. "Nia, about what?" "Edward, I've been hearing things. Let's be adults about this. You don't need to make it ugly." The words sat on the screen like oil on water, slick and surface level. She didn't respond. Later that night, she stood in front of her closet, sifting through the dresses she hadn't worn in years. Most of them still smelled faintly of the past. Nights at his company dinners, anniversary dates, holidays spent playing hostess. She ran her fingers over a pale beige gown she'd worn to a charity gala 5 years ago. It was soft, understated, elegant. She hadn't worn it since. She pulled it out and hung it on the door. In the morning, she would have it pressed. She also called a service. "I'd like to book a limousine," she said, her voice clear. The woman on the other end asked for the date and destination. "Friday, the county courthouse." There was a pause. "And the return trip?" Nia smiled faintly. No return needed. On Friday morning, she woke before dawn. She made breakfast for Caleb, packed his lunch, and walked him to the school bus. Then she returned home, dressed slowly, applied her makeup with deliberate care, and fastened a thin gold chain around her neck, the same one she had worn on their wedding day. Not because she wanted to remember, but because she wanted to bury that memory with dignity. At exactly 10:15 a.m., the limousine pulled up outside her apartment complex. It was sleek and black, its windows tinted. She stepped inside without hesitation, her hands resting calmly in her lap as the city passed by in soft blurs. Outside the courthouse, a small crowd had begun to gather. It wasn't large, but it was just enough. Friends of Edward's, perhaps, or people who had caught wind of the filing through the industry grapevine. She could feel their eyes on her as she stepped out of the car, but she didn't shrink. She walked forward with measured grace, heels clicking against the pavement like punctuation marks. At the top of the courthouse steps stood Edward. Claire was beside him, though she looked less confident than usual. Her usual glow was dimmed, her posture tight. Edward, on the other hand, looked furious. He started to speak, but Nia walked past them both without a word, her eyes fixed on the courtroom doors. Inside, Jordan met her with a nod. "Are you ready?" She nodded. The hearing began promptly. The judge reviewed the submitted materials, pausing more than once as he read through the evidence, the forged documents, the unpaid loans, the texts. Edward's lawyer objected, argued technicalities, attempted to diminish the significance of the fraud. But Jordan was precise, calm, unshakable. Then it was Nia's turn. She stood, her voice didn't tremble. "I trusted him," she said, "with my name, my time, my future. I believed in our life. I believed in our vows. And while I was believing, he was using. He signed my name to loans I didn't agree to. He made decisions that bound me legally and financially to choices I didn't make. That's not a marriage. That's manipulation." She looked at the judge, then at Edward. "This isn't about revenge. It's about truth. And truth doesn't live in shadows." The courtroom was silent. When the judge finally spoke, his voice was measured. "Based on the evidence submitted and the statements given, I find that the marriage was entered under conditions that constitute misrepresentation. The request for annulment is granted. Legally, this marriage never existed." Nia closed her eyes briefly. Not in pain. In release. As she walked out of the courtroom, past the people who had once whispered behind her back, past Edward and Claire who now stood like strangers caught in a collapse of their own design, she felt lighter. The limousine was waiting. She stepped inside. There was no need to look back. She wasn't returning to anything. She was moving forward into everything. The black limousine sliced through the morning haze like a whisper that refused to go unnoticed. Inside, Nia sat perfectly still, her posture regal, her hands folded lightly in her lap. The beige silk of her gown shimmered faintly in the filtered sunlight that spilled through the tinted glass. Her reflection stared back at her in the darkened window, not with doubt or uncertainty, but with quiet resolve. She wasn't heading to battle. She was arriving at the burial of an illusion. When the car eased to a stop in front of the Fulton County Courthouse, there was already a buzz outside. She hadn't invited it, hadn't courted the attention, but she wasn't surprised either. Edward had always kept powerful company, and gossip had a long memory. A few journalists lingered near the entrance, cameras slung lazily over their shoulders, waiting for something to happen. When the limousine door opened and Nia stepped out, heads turned. She did not flinch. She stepped down with calm grace, the hem of her gown catching the breeze like a sail. The murmurs started almost instantly, and somewhere behind the crowd a camera clicked, but she didn't hear it. She heard only her heels on stone, the rhythm of her own breath, and the steady chant of her thoughts. I'm not what they called me. I am what I chose to become. At the top of the steps, Edward was waiting. He looked exactly as she remembered. Crisp suit, expensive tie, the same cologne he'd worn for years. But the man himself was different. He looked restless, his eyes darting toward her and away again. Claire stood beside him, her arms crossed, her mouth drawn into a hard, nervous line. Her once confident air had soured into something brittle. She tried to meet Nia's gaze, but dropped it almost immediately. Nia didn't stop. She passed them both with only the faintest tilt of her head, her face unreadable. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with tension. Jordan was already there, standing near the front with a calm, focused energy. He greeted her with a quiet nod and gestured toward the long wooden bench beside him. She sat without a word, smoothing the fabric of her dress over her knees. Across the aisle, Edward took his seat beside his attorney. Claire, to Nia's surprise, remained in the gallery. She looked uncomfortable, as though she had realized too late that this was not the performance she had signed up for. The court clerk called the session to order, and the judge entered, an older black woman with silver-framed glasses and eyes that had seen everything. She adjusted her robe, glanced at the docket, and then raised her gaze. We're here today to consider a petition for annulment in the matter of Roberts versus Roberts, she said. Counsel, proceed. Jordan stood. His voice was measured and firm, not loud, but commanding in its precision. He presented the evidence like a surgeon making incisions, clean, necessary, without cruelty. He detailed the loans taken out in Nia's name without her consent, the forged signatures, the timelines that aligned with Edward's known financial strain. He handed the judge a packet of documents, including handwriting analysis and notarized statements. The courtroom was silent except for the rustle of papers and the occasional scratch of a pen. Edward's attorney objected frequently, citing lack of intent, suggesting misunderstanding, but each objection was calmly dismantled. The judge remained impassive, her pen moving steadily across her notes. When it was Nia's turn to speak, she rose slowly. She didn't hold a paper. She didn't need one. I was 24 when I married Edward, she began, her voice low but steady. We were young. We were hopeful. I believed in him. I believed in us. I left my career to support his. I managed our home. I raised our son. I signed the papers he asked me to sign. I trusted him. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle into the wood-paneled walls. And he used that trust to bind me to debts I didn't agree to. He forged my name on contracts. He involved me in financial risks without my knowledge. While I was preparing dinner, while I was helping our child with homework, while I was making sacrifices I never even named, he was signing away my name as though it belonged to him. The judge watched her closely. Edward looked down at the table. Claire shifted in her seat. I'm not here for revenge, Nia continued. I'm here because this was never a marriage built on mutual consent. It was a performance, one I entered in good faith and one he used for convenience. That is not love. That is not partnership. That is not legal. When she sat down, Jordan placed a hand lightly on her forearm, not for comfort, but acknowledgement. The judge called a short recess. As the court emptied, Edward approached her in the hallway. Claire was nowhere in sight. "Nia," he said. His voice was quiet, almost uncertain. "This isn't how it has to end." She turned to him, her expression calm. "It already ended, Edward. The day you decided to stop treating me like a person. I was trying to build something." "No," she said. "You were trying to cover your losses, and you used me to do it." He looked as if he might argue, but then he stopped. His shoulders dropped slightly. "I didn't think you'd go through with it," he admitted. "I know," she said. She walked away. Back inside the courtroom, the judge returned with her ruling. "In light of the evidence presented," she said, "the court finds sufficient cause to grant the petition for annulment. The marriage between the petitioner and the respondent is hereby declared null and void. All associated financial obligations assigned under fraudulent circumstances will be reviewed separately in a civil capacity." There was a pause, then the gavel fell. It was done. Nia stood. She didn't cry. She didn't smile. She breathed. Outside, the sun had broken through the morning haze. The limousine was waiting, its engine idling quietly. Cameras were still there, but fewer now, their interest already fading in the absence of scandal. Claire exited quickly from a side door, her face pinched. One of the reporters called after her, but she ignored them, disappearing into a waiting car. Edward emerged a few minutes later, slower, his lawyer trailing behind. He paused on the steps, glanced in Nia's direction, then looked away. Nia stepped into the limousine. The door closed behind her with a soft click, muffling the noise of the city. She leaned back against the seat and exhaled slowly, as if releasing years in a single breath. The car pulled away from the courthouse. She did not look back. There was nothing there for her anymore. Later that night, she sat with Jordan and Layla at her apartment, drinking tea and eating the strawberry shortcake Layla had brought from a bakery near her hotel. "You didn't just win," Layla said, raising her glass. "You ended it on your terms." "I didn't want to fight dirty," Nia replied. "And you didn't," Jordan said. "You fought smart, with truth." Caleb had gone to bed early, exhausted from a long week. The apartment was quiet, filled only with the soft hum of the dishwasher and the occasional laugh from Layla. At some point, Nia stepped onto the balcony, looking out over the city. The lights blinked gently in the distance, and the wind played with the loose curls that framed her face. Inside, she heard Layla telling Jordan about their childhood summers in Savannah. The sound was warm, familiar. She looked up at the sky. No ring, no title, just herself. And for the first time in a very long time, that was enough. The morning light touched everything in Nia's new home with a softness that made it feel like the world itself was taking a breath. The house sat at the edge of the city, not quite suburban, not quite urban, a modest two-bedroom bungalow with faded white shutters, an uneven porch, and a yard that needed love. It had no marble countertops or curated entryway, no winding staircase or glass wine cellar. But it was hers, bought with her name, her income, her decisions. The key turned quietly in the lock each time she came home, and the walls held no echoes of anyone else's voice but hers and Caleb's. That alone made it a sanctuary. She stood in the kitchen, barefoot, sipping coffee from a chipped mug, watching the wind brush through the hibiscus bushes along the fence. Caleb had left for school already, riding his bike down the gravel path that led to the bus stop, his laughter still lingering in the air. The silence in the house felt different now, no longer accusing or heavy. It was light, open, something she had learned to call peace. On the windowsill above the sink sat her journal, now worn at the edges from months of quiet war. She opened it slowly and flipped past the pages of pain, of evidence, of betrayal. The lines filled with her own handwriting were no longer jagged or angry. They had changed, grown steadier, softer. On the last page, she had written a sentence just 2 days earlier, one she had whispered aloud to herself afterward as if sealing a promise. I forgave myself for staying too long. I thanked myself for leaving in time. She gently closed the cover and set it back in the sun. That afternoon, Layla stopped by with a box of new linens and a container of homemade soup. They laughed as they unpacked the guest room together, hanging curtains and fluffing pillows, talking over one another like sisters do when grief has lost its hold and joy finds a way back in. "You know," Layla said as she smoothed out the quilt, "this room feels like a beginning, not like a spare." Nia smiled. "It is. Everything about this place is." Later, they sat on the porch with glasses of ginger lemonade, the breeze threading through their hair, the sky a watercolor of purples and blues. There was no heaviness in their silence, only the comfort of shared space. That evening, after Layla left and Caleb went to bed, Nia opened her laptop and logged into a video interview scheduled weeks ago. It was for a women's segment called She Rises, known for spotlighting stories of resilience and transformation. She had hesitated before agreeing, unsure whether she wanted her life, the wounds, the choices, the victories, placed under a public lens. But something about the host's invitation had felt sincere. Not sensational, but sacred. A place to speak, not perform. The host, a woman with a calming voice and a genuine smile, greeted her warmly. "We're so glad you're here, Nia. Share whatever you're comfortable with." Nia nodded slowly. "I'm ready." They started with small talk. Her work, the community project, the design firm's recent award. Then the questions deepened. "When did you know it was time to walk away?" the host asked gently. Nia took a breath. It wasn't a single moment. It was years of tiny betrayals, silences that screamed. Looking in the mirror and realizing I didn't recognize myself anymore, I stopped asking why he did what he did. I started asking why I stayed. The host's eyes glistened. The crew behind the camera was still. As the interview continued, Nia read aloud a few passages from her journal, not the most painful, but the most honest. She shared the sentence she had written the night the annulment was granted. "I don't want revenge, I want restoration, and I owe it only to myself." The clip went viral within hours. Women messaged her from across the country. Some sent thanks. Some shared their own stories. Some simply wrote, "Me too." Jordan called the next day to say, "You didn't just speak. You started something." "I only said what I wish someone had told me when I needed it," she replied. Life moved forward gently. Friday evenings became tradition. Jordan would bring pastries, Layla would make something warm, and they'd sit on the porch sharing stories, planting laughter in the night air. The conversations weren't about what had been lost anymore. They were about what could still be made. One afternoon, as she stood in front of her mirror, Nia made a decision she hadn't expected. She booked a haircut. The stylist greeted her with warmth and a clean cape, her fingers gentle as they brushed through the long coils of Nia's hair. "What are we doing today?" the stylist asked. "Something different," Nia said. "Something free." When she looked into the mirror afterward, she barely recognized the woman staring back. The tapered cut framed her face like a crown, her eyes clear and unflinching. She didn't look like someone recovering. She looked like someone becoming. She left the salon and walked to a nearby boutique, where she chose 2 outfits that made her feel bold and unapologetic. A soft ivory jumpsuit and a plum-colored dress that hugged her form like it knew her story. That evening, she modeled them for Layla and Jordan, spinning slowly in front of the mirror. "You look like someone who knows her worth," Layla whispered. Nia smiled. "I'm starting to believe I do." In the weeks that followed, she resumed therapy, sessions she had once abandoned when Edward mocked them. Her new therapist was kind but didn't coddle. Each conversation was another stone lifted, another lie unlearned. "Healing doesn't mean forgetting," the therapist said once. "It means choosing not to let pain narrate your future." Nia left that day feeling lighter, but the past wasn't quite finished. One morning, Jordan called with new information. They had dug deeper into Edward's financials. The signature forgery wasn't the only breach. He had tied her to a risky investment under a jointly named LLC, a business shell she had never agreed to form. "He forged your signature again," Jordan said. "And if we play this correctly, we can file for damages." Nia stared at the document he sent, her name printed in bold beside Edward's. "He didn't just cheat on me," she said quietly. "He used me legally, financially, intentionally." Jordan's voice didn't waver. "Then we don't just close this chapter. We hold him accountable." When the annulment hearing for financial fraud was scheduled, Nia didn't feel fear. She felt clarity. Edward had believed he could move on cleanly, but truth had its own timing, its own weight. The hearing took place quietly. No media, no spectators. Just Nia, Jordan, Edward, and his increasingly weary lawyer. The judge reviewed the evidence, listened to the testimony, and ruled in Nia's favor. Damages would be assessed. Edward left the courtroom without a word. As they walked down the hallway, Nia didn't feel triumphant. She felt whole. Weeks passed. Spring turned to summer. The days lengthened, the air warmed, and life returned in full color. One Saturday morning, Nia stood on the porch with a cup of tea as sunlight spilled across her lawn. She watched Caleb draw chalk designs on the sidewalk, spirals and suns and names of superheroes. "You want to help?" he called. "Always," she replied, stepping barefoot into the yard. Later that night, as the house settled into stillness, she walked from room to room, touching each surface with quiet reverence. The hallway mirror, the edge of the kitchen table, the books on the shelf. None of it was expensive, but all of it was real. She opened her journal one final time. On the last page, she wrote, "I learned that love should never cost you your name. I learned that peace makes no noise but changes everything. I learned that starting over is not a punishment. It's a gift." She set down the pen and closed the cover for the last time. The next morning, she began something new. No ceremony, no parade, just an open window, a quiet room, and a woman who had once been erased now writing her own story. And this time the page was truly hers. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more. Watch our other videos for powerful stories just like this one. And if you know someone who needs to hear this, share it with them.